One of the nice things about working in a classic area is that sometimes you can go back to sites that were described a century ago by famous people and see whether what they say was there actually is, and also see whether they missed anything. Because despite the incredible standard of collecting of some of these people, sometimes they weren't looking for exactly the same things as we are. Hello everyone! Thank you once again for tuning in for another instalment of Weird Fossil Discoveries. And just wanted to say to start with that I'm running a little bit slowly on uploads at the moment because I've got other work on at the same time. So that other work is a little bit different, although it does involve microscopes, in that I'm doing some surveys for mites and springtails living in soil at a very interesting site near here. So that's taking up quite a lot of my time, so I'm having to slightly slow down on this at the moment, but still trying to do at least one video a week. And I'm continually just blown away by the number of people who see fit to subscribe and to follow what we're doing and join in with all the comments, so it's lovely to have you all. And we're even up to 99 members, which is amazing. Thank you all, you're wonderful. So, this one I wanted to do today, though, is going back to a collection we made last summer, really. And it's a site that we'd never really been to before. I think I'd been there once when someone showed it to me 30 or 40 years ago, something like that. Anyway, it's one of the classic sites within the Builth-Llandrindod Inlier where we live. This is a Middle Ordovician volcanic island system with extraordinary detail of the ecology, the faunas and floras preserved around this island, from the very shallow water to the very deep water. And because of its historical importance, this area has been studied intensively for a long time. The first trilobites ever described were from here and Llandilo in 1698. So it goes back quite a long way. And it's more than that, though, because there's been a long history, particularly in the early part of the 20th century, 1920s, 1940, of work on the plumbing system of volcanic islands, the sedimentology and the faunas that inhabited a place like this. It really is one of the classic areas of geology. And so we had various people, including the legendary Gertie Elles, who was the graptolite expert at the time. She wrote with Ethel Wood the monograph on British graptolites from 1901 to 1918. And this monograph is still pretty much the standard work for a lot of the faunas in the UK. And a lot of the taxonomy has been updated, but it's good. And beyond that, we are forever blown away by how good a collector she was. Or she and Ethel Wood, and possibly some students, because I don't think she did all her own collecting. But when she says in the paper from 1940, when she describes the entire fauna and succession of graptolites and other things as well, actually, for the Builth Inlier, when she says that a species was there, it is there, even if nobody else has found it since. So, for example, at the Llanfair Quarries, which is a site she worked quite intensively, there was a monograph in 1987 on the graptolites of the area, the local area, where there was a long list of species that he could find, this is Richard Hughes, no evidence for existing at all, despite the fact that Ellis claimed they were there, so he just sort of didn't include them because there was no evidence they ever really existed. And in all the time we've spent working here, every now and then we turn up a first or second specimen of something that Ellis claimed was there. And no one else has seen since. But it was true, it was there. She just had so good an eye, or such a detailed collection, that it's reliable. What she wrote is valid. There may have been some splitting of one species into 3 or 4 subtle variations, but those variations will have been there. It's just that we no longer call them species. So it's incredible to have this this body of work, and not all of the early collectors were like that, but Gertie Ellis's work was spectacularly good. So, when we go back to a site that she described in some detail and see if we can find what she did, it's always quite fun. And in this case, it's not one of her major sites. It's one that had been looked at presumably fairly cursorily. She got several outcrops along a stream valley in the middle of the Inlier from some of the oldest rocks. This is in the Camnant Mudstones Formation, as we now call it. So these are laid down before the volcanoes erupted. This was when it was part of a continuous continental shelf which stretched up tens of kilometres up through the borders, and there are some faunas that you can match up with similar faunas in Shropshire of the same age, the same trilobites, the same brachiopods, and so on. And that's always nice to see. So, in this one, let's have a look what she found. So this is the paper, The Stratigraphy and Faunal Succession in the Ordovician Rocks of the Builth-Llandrindod Inlier, Vadnashire. And it says here, read January 11th, 1939, because it genuinely was read. This was the Quarterly Journal of the Geological Society, QJGS, and in those days you would read your paper to the Geological Society in their chambers in London. I think it was in London at that time, probably. And then you would have feedback from people, and there would be comments and questions and responses appended to the end of the published paper, which came out the following year, 1940. And they don't do it quite like that anymore, which is rather a shame, actually. But this is the paper. It's fairly long. You can see sort of 380 up to 444 in the page number, so, good 60-odd pages. And there's a lot of detail in here. She covers not everywhere in the whole area, but all these boxed areas are places that she goes into the stratigraphy in detail, and these are the places where we can go back and check up on her. Give her a mark out of 10, that sort of thing. So we're going to be looking at this area right in the centre of the Inlier, where there is, of course, a close-up map. And this is the upper part of that, going up towards the famous trilobite quarries on Gilwern Hill, private trilobite quarries. And then you have, under here, a whole sequence of shales with grits. This is a fauna that was studied intensively by John Cope in 1999 on the bivalve faunas that are included in here. So it's actually a very diverse, quite early bivalve fauna, and various other bits and pieces as well. And the trilobites in here and almost all the other species match up with the site in Shropshire. So this is a really nice section that I know well, although you have to wade through bracken about 6 feet deep to get anywhere near it. That was about 7, sorry. But it's quite funny if you go there with someone like Lucy in Midsummer, then you have to give her a hammer to wave over her head so you know where she is. It's quite easy to lose people in a place like that. There are also, though, further down here, a whole series of other exposures. And some of these we actually tried to locate again recently, but the ground was so wet we didn't get very far. Remember, this is about 85 years ago that these were described. And this whole area is moorland, it's quite boggy. So you end up with some difficulties locating the old outcrops because they can be covered over by mud, by sediment, by moss and plants and so on. And this whole area is common land, so it's quite easy access and it's not very tightly maintained, so things do grow in this area. And then there is this ravine gorge section down here at a place labelled as Court, which was an old exclosure. It's where someone basically claimed a bit of the common and fenced it off, probably illegally, post-medieval type time. And that farmstead is now gone, but the boundaries are still there. And it includes this little sort of ravine there and a few beds over this way. So here, where we went, the water was still quite high and it was difficult to get into this sort of area, so we didn't. But we did have a look at these lowest beds here. So let's see what she says about them. And unusually for her, she didn't seem to have found that much. So the lowest beds visible are seen to the west of Pendray. They are much disturbed and broken and consist of friable, rusty weathering shales with some thin mudstones and occasional sandy or gritty streaks and lenses. Remember that. That's going to be quite interesting. They appear to be almost unfossiliferous, but at one locality have yielded Didymograptus acutidens. Now that's an interesting one. It's now I believe, counted as an acrograptus. It's not a pendant Didymograptus, sort of tuning fork one, but one where the two branches go out sideways. So that would be definitely interesting, because we've never actually found that one in the Inlier. Passing along the stream in a northwesterly direction, these beds begin to dip more regularly to the west-northwest, and shortly before reaching Court, they are dipping steadily 15 degrees to the west-northwest, and here they are splendidly exposed in a cliff 20 feet section on the right bank. Consists of shales and bands of mudstone, somewhat irregularly bedded with sandy grits. So that's what we've got. There's actually very little here. We've got Didymograptus acutidens, and we have gritty streaks and lenses. And if there were trilobites there, she would have reported them. If there was anything else of interest, she would have reported them. Okay, that sounds like a challenge, doesn't it? So we took our local amateur fossil group along, and you can see how keen they are by the fact that some of them, yes, you, Jan, are willing to stand in the middle of the stream and get your feet completely soaked in the process. Dedication, that is. What can I say? I wasn't quite that dedicated, but, I did do a lot of jumping from one side to the other. But this is what the outcrops look like. It is not particularly promising. But these rocks have been weathering for, 80-odd years? I imagine somebody has had a good look there at some point, but it's really pretty much minimal exposure of useful rock. So we did do a little bit of sort of scraping around, got a few little bits out, obviously. Don't want to go sort of quarrying or anything like that. But we found bits and pieces. And it took some effort, because most of the fossils we were finding were very small. Most of them. But did we find Acrograptus acutidens? We did not. We did find a few things, though, including some graptolites. So let's have a little look at that. So this is the type of rock that we got. This is actually quite a nice big bit. You can see this rusty weathering surface. It's basically a muddy siltstone. And actually, just notice this has dried out a bit, and there's some cracks running in along there. So I've got a little sort of silicon carbide preparing tool, and I think I can just sort of wedge this in here without damaging the fossil and see what happens if I prise a bit off. Bits fall off everywhere, as you'd expect. Never mind, that's what hoovers are for. Is there anything in there? No, nothing much. But never mind. You spend a lot of time breaking rocks open like that to find the good stuff. But there's a little bit on here that we did find. So let me show you what we've got under here. Okay, you can see this is a very micaceous siltstone. Lots of little mica flakes in there. Quite coarse compared with a lot of mudstones. Lots of iron, obviously, it's weathering that rusty way. But then there's things like this. And there we have a very bad graptolite. Let's put the polarizer in, and you can see the carbon film goes black. Is that identifiable? No, it is not. That is a thing that Lucy would not be happy with. It is a diplograptid. You've got two sets of thecae, one running along the top, one along the bottom. It's lying on its side at the moment, but it's obliquely preserved, so we're not seeing a full lateral view. We're just seeing the thecae are mostly edge on, actually, which makes it impossible to get much further. It's probably a very common thing in this age rocks called Amplexograptus convertus, but we can't tell from that. That's not very good at all. But we can do better than that, honest. Let me just get a different one. Okay, this one's got a ring scratched around it. Oh, hello. Oh, we'll come back to that later. Oh, I didn't know that was on this specimen. I'm sure some of you know what that is, but we'll show you a better one at some point. Oh, there we go. Perfect, isn't it? Weathered surface. This is why we don't look at weathered surfaces most of the time. But luckily, this is also why we have a crossed polarizer. And there we go. We have a little graptolite. It's a little bit distorted, but the sicula, the growing point, or the first point of the colony, is that bit sticking out to the upper right. And then I'll just rotate this around a bit. And you can see it's got the two stipes, which are actually a bit mangled. They're sort of squidged in and compressed over each other, with the teeth on the inside, the little thecae are pointing inwards. This is a little pendant didymograptid, goes by the name of Didymagraptus artus, probably. There are a couple of other possible candidates like Nanus and things like that, but I'm pretty certain this is Didymagraptus artus, which is what you'd expect in the Didymagraptus artus biozone. And that's quite a nice little example, really. We've got some more, though. Let's find you another one. This one looks better. Again, polarizers in. Well, maybe it's not better. But, yeah, it's a bit incomplete, but at least it's in the right shape. It's just that a lot of the bits of the graptolite itself have flaked off. Yeah, okay, not very good either, but the same sort of thing. Can't even see the graptolite on here. We must have seen it in the field, but yeah, probably when it was wet. Quite often these specimens are actually very difficult. There we go, yeah. They're very difficult to see when the surface is dry or just a little bit damp, but immerse it in water and suddenly these things leap out. But there we go. It's another little graptolite. Didymagraptus artus, again, probably. Gives us the age, not much else. But that's fine. But, so that, well, Acrograptus was the one thing that Gertie Elles described them here, which is slightly surprising because we didn't see any of that, but we did get this artus. So there's something odd going on there. All right, but we did find some other things as well. And this is where it gets really quite nice. And I'm surprised that she missed them. In some ways, I'm surprised. Because in other ways, I'm not surprised because of just how tiny they are. So in the middle of this circle that I've scratched on the rock will be a thing. I can't even see it at that magnification. Let me... there we go. Take the polarizer out and then change the light direction. Let's make it just from one corner and then zoom in on this thing which is about 1 millimeter long. And oh, isn't it cute? It's a lovely little trilobite. That is a very early growth stage of probably Ogygenus cordensis. And the reason we know it's very early, apart from the minute size, because these things get up to about 10 centimeters long when they're adults, is that there are only 2 thoracic segments. And as an adult, it should have 6. And each time they molt and get bigger, they add another segment. And to start with, when they first come out the egg, they don't have any. So this has molted twice to get to these 2 segments. And that is a very, very tiny little trilobite. That is lovely. And we were actually finding a reasonable number of these once we got our eyes in. But mostly they were minute. Some of them got a little bit bigger. We did have... Where was it? Ooh, look at this one. Oh. This is gigantic. Well, it's not. But it's reasonably big. It's a molt. And you can see the molt. It's a molt because the pygidium, the tail section, has separated. Then you've got the thoracic segments all in one piece. And then the cephalon, the sort of head plus stomach plus other bits region, is actually distorted. It's sort of pushed backwards and kind of overlying some of the thorax, and bits of it are missing. So that is a classic molted exoskeleton. So it was living on the seafloor. It cast its old skin off and grew another one. And that is very typical arrangement, just one of those little snapshots. It hasn't been washed around in the current since that was molted. So this has been living on the seafloor, it's shed its skin there in that arrangement, pretty much probably exactly in that arrangement, which has gradually been covered by sediment, or quite suddenly, and we're left with this little snapshot of what life was like for this little thing before it sort of hopefully got bigger, but it's dominated by the juveniles here. And we've got another one here. I do want to show you this one, actually. So we have another couple of circles on the rock here, if you can find the circles. Yep, there's one there, and there we go. That is another juvenile trilobite pygidium, same species again, and I think one thoracic segment, maybe a couple. Yeah, maybe a couple if I rotate it. Yeah, a couple of thoracic segments and one pygidium, and that's it. So again, it's probably a malted piece of one of these exoskeletons. But there's another circle here, and this is a bit different. That is not a trilobite. That is a brachiopod shell. A very badly preserved one. It's got hardly any detail left, and it's broken along the edges, but that looks like the little round shell of Apatobolus micula, which I will have to do a whole video about. It thoroughly deserves it just by being the most ridiculously abundant fossil in this whole area that you could possibly imagine. Millions and millions and millions of the things. It's also in some ways incredibly dull in that it's defined on its lack of distinguishing features. It's a little round shell. But in other ways, it's actually really rather interesting. So yeah, we'll come back to that one in future. But Apatobolus micula is most likely that. And that was it for most of our fossils. We were getting a significant number of tiny trilobites, a few graptolites, and I think that was probably the only brachiopod we found. May have been one or two others, but yeah, another trilobite. And then, after that, it got really interesting. The entire lower half of this box is actually filled with other things. And these are things that Ellis did in fact mention. She described these sandy lenses and stringy bits. And if we have a look at these rocks, you very quickly start seeing these little coarser things going through the middle of the surface. So that there is a, well, it looks a bit coarser, a bit sandier, and it takes a little bit of looking at to work out exactly what it is. But again, if we have a look at this under the microscope, ideally with low angle light, then it starts to make a bit more sense. The first thing to spot is that these little streaky things are not sandia. This is the sediment that we're looking at here in the background of the rock. And then we move on to this area, which is this stringy bit that goes to the cross surface, and the sediment doesn't change. It's exactly the same material. It's not sandy, it's not coarser, and yet somehow it is. It looks coarser. I mean, you can see this is a really lumpy texture. Now, understanding these things often takes a little bit of careful manipulation of the light. So if I then rotate the light angle until we start seeing things in different orientations, shadows start leaping out, then suddenly it makes a different sort of pattern entirely. What we've got here is a densely packed, almost random array of little spindle-shaped things, little sort of almost like tablets, a fusiform, something like that. And you've got this array of little elongate structures all jumbled around on top of each other in different orientations, and you see different ones with the light picking them out at different angles. But it's a dense mass of little things like grains of ice almost. And you can start to see that when you get the angles right and all the way along these elongate structures, and there's another one along the edge of the slab here. Let's have a look at that. Oh, that's a nice clear one, isn't it? Yeah, look at that. This one doesn't look quite so randomly densely packed. We've got here, oh, perfect, little grains of ice. And there it is. And these particles, these objects are made of the same sediment as the background. There's nothing different about the sediment. It's just that the sediment has been packaged into little structures like that. And that, we kind of know what it is. Oh, look at that. It's lovely when the light just sort of brings it all out like that. These are pellets. They are a thing called tomaculum, and they are actually very well known, particularly from the Cambrian and Ordovician. There are other names as well of similar sorts of things, Copranus, I think, But Tomaculum is the one that I'm familiar with them under the name of. And what you have here are actual burrows. These elongate structures are burrows, but they are packed full of these little pellets. And once we realized what we were seeing, we were finding them everywhere. So you take a little surface like that, and you can start to see, if I can get the light on it, that there are multiple bits. There's one going around. Yeah, they're all over the place, basically. They're going in all orientations. The surfaces are covered by, well, there's one there, one going there, here. Yeah, they're everywhere. These are quite abundant structures. These burrows were going through some of these layers of rock very extensively, and something was making them. And presumably, either they were permanent burrows, in which case it was effectively using its disused parts of the burrow as a latrine and just packing all the pellets there, or it was something that was moving through the sediment and ingesting all of it and then excreting almost all of it as well. And there are things like that. I mean, these pellets are made of sediment. So it does look like it was probably a deposit feeder, something which ingests the sediment, digests anything good that it can get out of it, and then deposits the rest of it behind it. So we didn't get really nice, clear burrow networks or anything like that. We couldn't find any branching. But we were getting quite a lot of information about its abundance. And one thing that's really interesting is we have never seen this elsewhere in the Builth-Llandrindod Inlier at all. We've seen it in other places. So in the Afon Gam biota, for example, in North Wales, we found burrows there which are packed full of these Tomaculum pellets. In other parts of the world as well, we've seen them in Bohemia, they're quite common. In southern France, we've seen them as well. And they are quite well known in the Cambrian rocks too. So it was an organism that was doing this, or multiple different organisms, and they were generating a lot of burrows by deposit feeding. So what would have made something like this? For that, we have no idea from looking at this material, so we have to go into the wider literature and see what we can get from that, because people have obviously thought about it. And there are basically two main candidates. Firstly, we have priapulids. These are an abundant group of fossils in the Cambrian Burgess Shale type faunas, and these and the related paleoscolicodons and various other groups of early worms that molted, some of them have very clearly Tomaculum-like pellets preserved inside their digestive tract. So these things are actually producing pellets. These ones are Selkirkid, they actually live inside a tube, but you get them in various other ones as well. And so we are pretty confident that priapulids, which were abundant in the Cambrian at least, and probably the Ordovician, but we don't have so much of the right preservation for them, were generating large numbers of these little pellets. Other priapulids, however, from the Burgess Shale and elsewhere, were predators. So we know that because their stomach contents include entire shells of hyolithids and things like that. But some of them at least seem to have been deposit feeders and were able to ingest large amounts of sediment and produce these pellets. So that's one option. However, they don't only occur, these fossils, in the Cambrian Ordovician. There are similar things at various points through the fossil record in the Carboniferous, in the Cretaceous, and even in the modern. And in the modern, we know what was doing it. So that brings us to the other main candidate, which is annelid worms. And there are papers which have shown that in modern sediment cores, you can cut through burrows made by polychaete worms, annelids, and find that some of them are partly stuffed full of these little pellets in exactly the same sort of morphology, made of the same sort of sediment as the surroundings, and it's quite likely that these were also able to make these burrows that were packed full of these little pellets. So what's likely in the case here? We just don't know. We don't have soft tissue preservation at that level. we don't see anything except the burrows filled with pellets. We have a very odd ecology. There's not much there, just these very young trilobites, very few graptolites, very rare brachiopods, and really nothing else that we found, apart from abundant burrows filled with pellets made by deposit feeders. So the ecology of this particular place, as far as we can see, and there will be a lot of soft body things that we are not seeing, remember, but as far as we can see, the ecology was dominated by infaunal worms that were burrowing through and ingesting the sediment. Now, that could have been priapelids. We know palaeoscalecids are fairly common and quite diverse within the Builth Inlier, but all the ones we found are too small. They are millimetre wide mostly, whereas these are getting up to 5 millimetres wide, centimetre even. So it's a much larger worm than anything that we have found as palaeoscalicid cuticle fragments. Doesn't necessarily mean much. It's also restricted to before the volcanic activity started to get going. And that's interesting because we do see, in some environments at least, a radical change in the ecology after the main phase of the volcanism, where you get the local species apparently wiped out and then new species coming in from southwest Wales and then becoming dominant. This is particularly in the shallower water environments. In the deeper water, they could just colonize again from the surrounding areas. So it's an odd bit of ecology. And we have one more set of fossils that just add a little bit to the oddness. Let's have a look at this last one. Here we go. We only have one or two surfaces like this, but the daylight is just coming through the window at the right sort of angle. And you can see that's a very oddly textured, weathered surface. That is a bedding plane as far as we can make out, and it's got all sorts of weird features to it. So let's have a little look under here and see what we can get out of this. Right, we zoom out, and you can see to start with, it's just really oddly lumpy. Polarizer doesn't do a lot for this one, so we'll keep that one out. And there are strange little wrinkle marks in different places. There's a lot of little crystals on the surface. A lot of that, I think, is secondary mineralization. And let me just move this around a bit. You've got this very strangely lumpy, irregular surface, and then what look like creases and folds in the surface itself. You go up to this area, and you have a large crease, which sort of marks out this sort of rounded area. But then within that, there are finer little wrinkles and all sorts of weird little textures going on. So I will do a stitch of this just to give you a bit of a better idea of what it looks like in total. Okay, this is absolutely typical of a certain type of sedimentary surface which is not entirely inorganic. It's what we call elephant skin texture, and it is particularly common in the Ediacaran, when the seafloors were covered by microbial mats, and these mats give it a certain rigidity. The surface of the sediment becomes a little bit tougher, it's more coherent. And so when you get currents washing over it, rather than just sort of moving as individual particles, it wrinkles and sort of crunkles, and you get little lobes and things like that developing. And as a result, you see preserved in the rock record, when it gets covered over by more sediment, structures exactly like this. And you can see examples that are very, very similar to this in rocks all around the world, from particularly that Ediacaran into the early Cambrian sort of time interval. And also after mass extinctions and at various other points in history as well, you get microbial mats taking over when ecology was upset or when conditions were quite harsh. So, for example, in lagoonal environments, you can quite often see things like this as well. And this is not quite what you expect to find in the middle of the Ordovician in a perfectly comfortable sort of environment on the continental shelf. It's a bit odd. there's something peculiar going on here. And I think that's really our conclusion, isn't it? There's something peculiar going on here. This is so different to everything else that we have seen in the Builth-Inlier. Trace fossils in general are extremely rare in the Builth-Inlier. Occasionally you get a little burrow going into the top of a volcanic ash bed. There's a few places in the sandstones where we can see trails and traces, but most of the time you don't see anything. It's really interesting to have even just a site with abundant trace fossils. Even in the Camnat Mudstones formation, we don't tend to see them, except maybe at the boundaries between mudstone and sandstone layers. So it's odd. And Gertie Elles didn't necessarily see this particular layer, but she saw these fossils and recorded them as these strings and lenses of sandy material. And that's, of course, not quite what they are because it's not sandy. It's just pelleted. But she wasn't interested in the paleoecology. She was interested in the stratigraphy, working out the sequence of fossils through the sequence so she could more accurately date things. But there is a lot more of a story here to the ecology. It's an interval, the Camnat Mudstones formation in general, which is relatively poorly known compared with the rest of the Inlier. Partly because there's not so much exposure. The exposure is pretty poor. It doesn't also have the spectacular faunas that we get higher up in the sequence, full of trilobites and so on. We don't tend to see that so much. But now to have another little layer that we look at and find that it has abundant tomaculum pelleted burrows, which we've not seen anywhere else in the Inlier, and reasonably common tiny juvenile trilobites of a species that is known to be juvenile dominated in its ecology, so that's not too much of an issue. But almost nothing else. Only a couple of those little Apatobolus micula brachiopods when you'd expect billions of the things. The graptolites are also quite scarce. It's generally a very depauperate fauna. And then you get layers with microbial matte textures on the surface. That's weird. This is a big gap in our understanding of the ecology of the Inlier, and it means we're going to have to spend quite a bit more time trying to understand what was going on in the Camnat Mudstones. Because it should have been aerobic, it should have been relatively shallow, storm and wave dominated shelf environment with lots and lots of benthic shelly fossils, and sometimes you get layers with abundant bivalves or brachiopods or trilobites, but there is quite a lot which is more or less barren. And if we're starting to see microbial mats and these tomaculum-dominated burrows, and if those were related to priapulids, then they might be indicating a relatively low oxidation condition. So maybe we're not seeing disturbance of the mats because there weren't any grazers. Maybe the things that needed higher oxygen levels couldn't survive in this environment. It's just things we don't know. And this is the wonder of paleontology. You can spend 30 years studying an area and then just go on a random foray to look up an old locality and see if they missed anything, and find that it implies something about this ecosystem that you had no idea about. Gonna have to go back. There are so many sites we're gonna have to go back to. It's wonderful in a way, but it's the wonder of this sort of subject that paleontology is something where you can never really think that you've exhausted anything. No matter how well you think you know a deposit or a sequence or an area, you'll have missed an awful lot. Anyway, I hope you like that. I'll be going back to a couple of other things in fairly near future. So I'm looking at a couple of Ediacaran papers that have been coming out recently and having a look at that, and also thinking about another little sort of Ediacaran quandary. So we'll have a bit more Ediacaran in the future. So until then, though, I shall see you again. And thank you again for your attention. Lovely to have you all here. And yes, enjoy your fossils, because you're bound to have been going out finding some by now, haven't you? Haven't you?